So when we're studying theology, a lot of people approach it as a series of doctrines, a series of abstract ideas. But I think it's important to approach theology as a story. And that's really what the discipline of biblical theology does. Um, when we study biblical theology, we're studying the redemptive historical narrative, the story of salvation, the story of God's purposes for the earth as God works out his providences in human history. And I think one of the reasons that we enjoy stories so much, why we enjoy novels, fairy tales, myths, and so forth, is because the things we enjoy in stories are true of the story that we're living out in the universe, the master story that God is telling in the world. The things we enjoy in good stories, such as escaping danger and finding meaning through struggle and sacrifice, those things are enjoyable precisely because these things are true of each of our stories. They're true of our individual stories that we're living out, but they're also true of the grand master story of the universe that God is writing. When a story is told well, it's deeply true, even if it's not factually true, even if the story never happened. A fairy tale or a myth or a novel can be deeply true to the type of creatures we are, and true to the type of world we inhabit, and true to the story of the universe. And if you think about it, in the real world, monsters can always be defeated, there is always hope, and everyone's true nature is eventually revealed. And so when a story echoes these truths, when the story plays with these different themes and symbols, we enjoy it. We enjoy the story because it's true to the world that we live in. In the real world, we discover ourselves not through a process of self-making, but through humility, through virtue, and through the arts of self-limitation and sacrifice. And so when a story reflects these patterns, we enjoy the story. We enjoy the story because it's true to the world in which we live and to the master story that God is writing in the universe. In the real world, selfishness leads to loss and division, but virtue leads to restoration. And pride leads to folly, but humility leads to wisdom. And true love is found not in consuming and devouring, but in self-giving and sacrifice. Those things, those themes, those patterns are deeply true of our world. And so a good story will reflect those patterns, and a bad story will subvert or twist these patterns. And that's how we know the difference between a good story and a bad story. A good story is not necessarily a story that has a moral or tells us a lesson or teaches us in a direct way, but a good story embodies and shows these patterns at work. And so as we immerse ourselves in the story, we are we are also becoming familiar with these types of patterns that that God has embedded in our world. But more than that, good stories provoke emotional sympathy, a heart response to these rightly ordered patterns. A Good stories help us to be attracted to what is good, and often more effectively than just instruction. A story can go past all the roadblocks that we put up in our mind that might otherwise stand in the way of us being attracted to the good, the true, and the beautiful. So when we read a good story, we're like, yeah, I want to be like that. Or yeah, that's right. That's how the world works. And this ultimately, a good story helps us to want to be good, helps us to want to avoid the vices and foolishness that we see other characters making, and to embody the characters who show courage and who are mentors and who help us to overcome the darker side of our nature, to um, to attain to what is good, to attain to the light. We understand the world and ourselves through stories, and we become the stories that we tell and love. The stories that we enjoy, the stories that we allow to form our imagination, actually end up influencing us to become a certain type of man or woman. And ultimately, stories help each of us to answer the questions that are crucial to our own real life's hero's journey, including questions like, what does flourishing look like? What am I being called to sacrifice in order to bring about a better world? Who are the true mentors in my life? How can I become truly human? If we are to navigate and answer and wrestle with these questions with wisdom and virtue, we need to have good stories to help us, to help guide us on life's journey. Each of us is living through our own hero's journey as we move from the known to the unknown, as we meet mentors, make sacrifices, and receive gifts with which we can overcome the darkness of our lives and help others. But each of us are really living in two stories. We're living in our own individual hero's journey, but we're also living in the story of the cosmos, the story of the universe, the master story that God is working out in the unfolding of history through the progress of the gospel. And we call that larger story the redemptive historical narrative. Now, I want you to remember that for the midterm exam. The story of the universe, the master story that God is working out in the unfolding of history, is called the redemptive historical narrative. That's an important term to remember because that comes up a lot in theology. The redemptive historical narrative. It's the grand story that God is working out through history from creation through to the new heavens and the new earth. So just remember that because it will be on the exam. The redemptive historical narrative. So biblical theology is really a story, and it helps us to approach it as a story. It's a true story. Christians believe that it's a true story, but it's still a story. And when we understand the redemptive historical narrative as a story, we're able to see features and patterns and symbols that might be invisible to us if we were just approaching theology as a set of truth claims, a set of doctrines, a set of abstract ideas. When you approach the biblical theology as a story, you're able to understand it so much better, and you're able to see how how the other stories that we tell and love, stories like Narnia, stories like The Wind in the Willows, different myths, how these echo. These are echoings of the master story that God is telling in the universe. And so I'd like to just walk through the biblical story, telling it as a story. And along the way, I'll note you to some things that will be on the midterm exam. So in the very beginning of this story, in the time of history called the early world, the Creator made the heavens above where the angels dwell, and he made the earth beneath where the animals live. And on the earth, he built a garden temple called Eden, a little piece of heaven on earth that he could call home. And that will be on the exam, so make sure you make a mental note of that. What did the Creator make as a little piece of heaven on earth? A garden temple called Eden. This was a place where he could be at home, a little part of the earth that he could call home. And God placed his images in the garden temple, a man named Adam and a woman named Eve. The man and the woman were made of the ground, sharing earth life with the beasts, but they were also spiritual, sharing heaven life with the angels. And he gave He gave the man and woman a job to do, asking them to be a family of kings and priests. As priests of the garden temple, the man and woman became a frontier, a barrier, a connection between earth and heaven. They were to connect heaven and earth by reflecting God's glory into the world, and by offering everything in the world, especially all their love, work, and creativity, offering it to Him in worship. And as a family of kings, the man and woman reflected the Creator's loving rule to creation, lifting the earth and its animals towards heaven. They were to have lots of children and to expand the garden temple so the entire earth could become God's special home. He made the Garden of Eden a special home, a special garden temple for Himself. But He told the man and woman to expand the garden temple so that the entire earth could become God's special home. And in time, the Creator's loving presence would fill the entire earth like the waters cover the sea. Now, in those days, the Creator lived with the man and woman, walking and talking with Him in the garden. The man and woman lived in harmony with each other and with the animals and with God. They lived by love, humility, and kindness, and there was peace on the earth. But one of God's angels became jealous. He wanted to deflect worship away from God and onto the things of the earth. He wanted the man and woman to turn from their royal priestly calling to become like the beasts. So the deceiver tempted Adam and Eve to disobey God. Then, instead of enjoying the Creator's presence, they hid from Him. They stopped acting as God's kings and priests. This is the event that we call the fall, and it resulted in death and in men and women losing the authority that they had over the earth, resulting in natural disasters like earthquakes, floods, fires, and hurricanes. And this will be on the exam. So, on the exam, you will be asked you will be asked to know these bullet points that I just put on the board. So be sure to make a little mental note of that. And this is very important within the story of redemption, within the story of the universe. All good, truly good stories have some sort of fall, and then there's a process of redemption afterwards. There's something that goes wrong in the story, but then there's a journey. You go on the hero's journey, and in the process, evil is defeated and things are put right, and there's redemption. And that's what happens in our story, the biblical theology story, but not for many years. It takes a long time for God to put things right. And that leads to the next part of our story. So God gave the man and woman hope. He banished them from the garden. He banished them from His presence. They went into exile. But just before their long exile, He gave the human family a promise. He gave a promise to the woman. He said that one of her descendants would crush the deceiver's head. Now, that didn't happen for a long time. What initially began to happen was that cut off from God's presence, men and women began to die. And as we said before, the ground began to rebel against man's rule. Man lost the authority that he had over the earth, and so there was disease and famine and forest fires and earthquakes, and evil things, evil spirits and demons grabbed the authority that had once belonged to humans. And instead of love, humility, and kindness, people grew strong in hate and pride and cruelty. People began to hurt themselves. They began to hurt the animals. And saddest of all, men and women lost the close presence of their Creator, who had once walked and talked with Him in the garden. And as the human family suffered, they remembered God's promises, and they hoped that they would be delivered from the deceiver's control. But Days became weeks, weeks became months, months became years, and God's promise became a distant memory. But Adam's family never forgot the beautiful garden where the Creator had walked and talked with his creatures. And they never forgot the promise given to the woman that one of her offspring, one of her descendants, would break the power of the deceiver. Yet the door to the tree of life, the door to God's presence, remained closed. As time passed, men and women grew stronger in wickedness. People began worshiping the things of the ground, and evil became strong on the earth. Instead of offering everything on the ground to God in worship, people began surrendering their authority over to false gods and to idols. And this made the power of the deceiver grow even stronger. Lured by his false promises, mighty men sought to bring back paradise through war, through magic, through false wisdom and tall towers, including one tall tower called the Tower of Babel. But nobody could find the way back to the tree of life. God did not forget his promise. God longed to see the world healed. He longed to see creation ordered under the loving rule of his human kings and priests. He longed for his loving presence to fill the earth as the waters cover the sea. And so he called a man named Abraham to help him rescue the earth. Abraham is known as a patriarch. And that brings us into the next stage of the redemptive historical narrative, the patriarchs. The word patriarch means forefathers, and it refers to Abraham and his son Isaac and his son Jacob. These are forefathers of the faith, patriarchs. Remember that for the exam. That's going to be one of the multiple choice questions on the midterm exam. Now, God said he would make Abraham and the other patriarchs, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants, into a mighty nation. He said they would be a new frontier between earth and heaven. They would be a nation of kings and priests. He is renewing the human vocation, the human job in Abraham's family. He also promised Abraham's family a land to remind them of Eden, to remind them of the lost garden. He would make a land where he would be present with them, just like he had been present with them in the Garden of Eden. And this land would become a new frontier between earth and heaven. And in this land, men and women could learn how to live in harmony with each other, with the animals, and with their Creator. And maybe now the earth could be healed. Maybe now the human race could be rescued from the deceiver's slavery. Maybe now God's loving presence could flood the earth like the waters cover the sea. But the earth kept rebelling. There continued to be floods, earthquakes, and famines. During one famine, Abraham's family traveled to Egypt in search of food. But in Egypt, the deceiver's power was strong. The Egyptians forced Abraham's family to work for them. The people that God had chosen to lead the human race out of slavery were turned into slaves themselves, forced to build temples to false beast gods. The Egyptians worshipped beasts and forced Abraham's family to make idols and statues for them to worship. And although they were enslaved, Abraham's descendants still became a mighty nation. They stayed in Egypt for over 500 years and became the mighty nation of Israel. And as they suffered in slavery, they remembered God's promises and hoped for an exodus. Now, exodus is an important word. It means exit. It means escape. That will be on the exam, so remember that. So they hoped that God would give them a deliverance, an escape, an exodus. But days became weeks, weeks became months, months became years, years became centuries, and God's promise became a distant memory. But God was listening to the prayers of his people. He heard the cries of his people and remembered his promises. He remembered the promises he had made to Abraham's family, and even all the way back to Adam and Eve. And so he raised up a deliverer named Moses. Moses led Israel out of slavery into the wilderness towards the land God had given to Abraham. And again, this is known as the Exodus. Also remember for the exam that Abraham's family became the mighty nation of Israel, and that God raised Moses to lead them out of Egypt. So Moses led Israel out of slavery into the wilderness towards the land God had given Abraham. But they couldn't enter the land right away. First, God needed to show them how to be kings and priests, how to spread heaven life throughout the earth. So he gave them books of laws showing how to reflect his glory to creation and how to offer creation back to him in worship. He showed them how to enter the gates of paradise through love, humility, and kindness. He showed them how to be truly human. Moses made a special tent for God to come into, with pictures on it that recalled the garden temple, pictures that remembered Eden. And God came and lived in the tent and walked and talked with Moses inside the tent. It was like the doorway to the Garden of Eden had become open a little crack, heaven connected with earth again, but just a small part of the earth. So God is coming back to his people, but in a small way, in this tent that Moses made for God to live in. It's called the tabernacle. But God's people wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. This was a time of testing, a time of teaching. God wanted his people to know how to be truly human and how to live in love with him before they went into the land. And during this time of testing, many people were overcome by the deceiver. And when their time of testing was complete, God brought them into the land that he had promised to Abraham. While Israel had been away, however, God's enemies had moved into the promised land. By worshiping beast gods, these enemies had become like the beasts. It was almost like they had stopped being human. And so there was a period of conquest, a period of conquering the land. And God took the land from the enemies to show that he was stronger than the false gods. And he raised up judges and prophets to show the people how to be truly human. Finally, God raised a king named David and made a royal kingdom for himself. God gave a throne to David and promised that his kingdom would be part of the promise to heal the earth. Inspired by this hope, David's family turned Moses' tent into a beautiful temple. The tabernacle that God had lived in with Moses in the wilderness became a permanent house, and God came and lived in this house, this temple. It had many icons, many pictures, statues that reminded the people of Eden and the tree of life. And the temple had many priests, recalling the human job of connecting earth and heaven. God came down to live in the temple, and the doorway to paradise was opened a little bit more. Maybe now the earth could be healed, but that isn't what happened. Israel followed the deceiver. Rather than working together, God's people fought against each other, dividing into two nations. So David's kingdom became divided. And many of their kings sought to bring back paradise through war, through magic, through false wisdom, and through tall towers. Rather than worshiping God, they worshiped idols. The people God had chosen for leading the human race out of slavery became enslaved to the deceiver. Because of their disobedience, God's people went into exile. They were banished from his presence in this land. God's enemies came in and took the people away into exile. And so David's throne sat empty. Their creator no longer lived in his temple. God's people suffered, and the power of the enemy grew strong. Evil spiritual powers ruled the world through beast kingdoms, grabbing the authority that had once belonged to God's people. Yet hope was not totally lost. God gave special messages to his prophets. He said he would lead the creation through a second Exodus. Remember, there had been the first Exodus when Moses had led God's people out of slavery in Egypt. And God said through prophets that there would be a second Exodus when he would lead his people out of the slavery of sin and death. And one prophet, Daniel, saw that a son of man would come and sit on David's throne, rescuing humans from the beast kingdoms of the deceiver. Then maybe men and women could serve the Creator as kings and priests. Then maybe the earth would be healed. Then maybe God's presence would fill the earth like the waters cover the sea. Then maybe the door to the tree of life would be open. But nobody knew who this Son of Man would be or how he would come. Days became weeks, weeks became months, months became years, and God's people never forgot the Garden of Eden. They never forgot the promise that a man would crush the deceiver's head. And they never forgot the temple where a small part of heaven had come back to the earth. And they never forgot God's promise to send the Son of Man to lead a second Exodus. But nobody knew who the Son of Man would be or how he would come. Now, God did bring some of his people back to the land of promise. But he did not return to his house. David's throne sat empty. The earth continued to rebel. False gods ruled through one beast kingdom after another. The door to the tree of life remained closed. It was like being slaves in Egypt all over again, even though some of God's people were living in the land. They were living in the land, but they were enslaved to one foreign power after another. And of course, they were still enslaved to sin and death and idolatry. God's people waited, and the power of the beasts grew strong. One beast kingdom called Babylon had risen out of the sea like a lion with eagle's wings. Then came a second beast kingdom like a bear called Medo-Persia. Then came a third beast kingdom called Greece. This was like a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. And then came another beast kingdom with large iron teeth and 10 horns. This kingdom was called Rome and began to devour the whole earth. And as the power of these beast kingdoms grew strong, the Creator never forgot his promise to send a Son of Man to reestablish human authority over the false gods. But nobody knew who this Son of Man was or where he would come from. But then something wonderful happened. During the rule of the fourth beast kingdom, when everything seemed lost, God rose up to act. He remembered his promises and sent the Son of Man to earth. But who was the Son of Man? The Son of Man was God himself. The Creator came down to earth, the Son of Man and the Son of God. The Son of Man is God himself in human form. We call this the Incarnation. He entered the earth through the womb of the Blessed Virgin. He became a baby and was born with human life. He shared human life with his creatures. And his mother, Mary, was like a second Eve. She was like a frontier between earth and heaven, just like humans had been meant to be from the very beginning. And the God-man, Jesus Christ, walked and talked with people, just like in Eden, and like in the tabernacle with Moses, and like in the temple with David's family. But this time, he came and walked and talked with all humanity. He took on the humanity of his people so that he could heal us. The God-man, Jesus Christ, wandered in the wilderness for 40 days and overcame the deceiver. When the time of his testing was complete, he worked miracles, taking back the authority that rightfully belonged to man. He told stories that showed how to be part of his Father's kingdom. He showed how to worship the Creator and spread heaven life to others. He taught that the kingdom of God was coming to earth as in heaven. This made the deceiver so angry that he decided to kill the God-man. Jesus loved the creatures he made so much that he let himself be sacrificed. Nobody knew, but this was all part of God's plan. The God-man died and went into exile, into the heart of the enemy's land. He suffered and the power of the enemy grew strong. But when all seemed lost, the God-man crushed the head of the deceiver and defeated all the rebellious spiritual powers. Then Christ rose from the dead, bringing the descendants of Adam and Eve out of death's slavery. He brought about a second Exodus, delivery from death and sin itself. Christ conquered death first in his own body. He rose from the dead and appeared in the garden and walked and talked with Mary Magdalene and others. And then for 40 days he walked and talked with many, many people. It was like being in the Garden of Eden all over again. And when his time on earth was complete, Christ ascended to heaven with a merry noise, joining humanity with God and joining earth with heaven. Then the Son of Man sat on David's throne. Christ flung open the doorway to paradise. A new creation had begun. From his throne, he scattered gifts to men and women. He gifted us his Spirit so we could become a nation of kings and priests, reflecting his glory into the world and offering all of our love, work, and creativity to him in worship. And remember that for the exam, who do Christians believe is the Son of Man sent by God to defeat the deceiver and open the doorway to paradise? It's Jesus Christ, the God-man. So again, who do Christians believe is the Son of Man sent by God to defeat the deceiver and open the doorway to paradise? The answer is Jesus Christ. He's called the Son of Man because he's a real human being. But we also believe that he is God. He's both God and man. And as such, he joins heaven and earth back together so that we, in him, can be united with our Heavenly Father. He gifted us his flesh as the tree of life, so that by eating the bread of immortality, the Eucharist, we can join with his heaven life. He gifted us his body, the church, as a new frontier between earth and heaven. Now all of God's people can join Abraham's family and be part of the world's healing. Now people can begin living in harmony with the Creator, with each other, and with the animals. Now the entire earth can become God's special land. Now all the nations of the world can be saved into God's kingdom through faith, love, humility, and kindness. But this angered the deceiver, who refused to acknowledge that the God-man had become king of the world. The deceiver did not want to admit that the God-man was now king of the world. And as the final beast kingdom lay dying, the deceiver tried to kill all of God's people. But this only made Christ's kingdom grow stronger. Finally, the emperor of the fourth beast kingdom, a kingdom called Rome, bowed before the God-man. And as a result, the love, work, and creativity of God's people began filling more and more of the earth. And days have become weeks, weeks have become months, months have become years, years have become centuries, and heaven life continues spreading throughout the world. Through love, kindness, humility, and repentance, the way to paradise is open wide, and the earth has begun to heal. Through the church, men and women have become a new frontier between earth and heaven. And the God-man promised to come again and raise all his people from the dead. And then he will finish healing the earth, making the entire world into a beautiful garden city. And remember this for the exam. The promise of united heaven and earth will be complete when he comes back. After he comes again, he will finish healing the earth, and the Creator's loving presence will flood the world like the waters cover the sea. This great work has begun, and God invites all of us to be part of that. So again, the God-man, Jesus, promised to come again and raise all his people from the dead, and then he will finish healing the earth, making the entire world into a beautiful garden city, a temple for him. So that is the story of our world. That's the story of the universe that God is writing. It's the true hero's journey story, the hero's journey of the human race. But each one of our own stories, each one of our own hero's journey stories is situated within the context of this larger story. And one of the reasons, to go back to what I said at the beginning, one of the reasons that we enjoy good stories, good novels, good myths, good folk tales, good fairy tales, one of the reasons we enjoy them is because they tell and retell these patterns that are at the heart of the world story, at the heart of the redemptive historical narrative. The redemptive historical narrative of biblical theology that we've just walked through is about good defeating evil. It's about finding who you really are through sacrifice and humility. It's about receiving gifts that help you then to go forth and defeat the giants and the dragons that are trying to hold you back. Jesus gives us gifts in the church through which we can defeat the deceiver in his power, because he went into the land of the deceiver and defeated him through his sacrifice. And when we read and enjoy good stories, good fairy tales and myths and legends and folk tales and novels, good stories that embody and portray these same patterns, it resonates with our hearts because it's true of the world's story, and it's true of each of our stories. In each of our story, we are engaged in a process of fighting the dragons, fighting the inner dragons and the exterior enemies that would hold us back. Each of our stories is about good conquering over evil and making sacrifices to help the people that we love. And when I read good stories, especially stories that are written by Christians, it helps me to better understand and be part of this overarching master story of the redemptive historical narrative. And one such story is the book that C.S. Lewis wrote, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This story, even though it is fiction, it's deeply true to the type of world that we live in, because many of these themes that are part of the biblical story, part of the redemptive historical narrative, come out in this story that C.S. Lewis has written about two brothers and two sisters. And C.S. Lewis wrote many other books and stories that have the hero's journey in it, and in which we see people receiving gifts through which they can overcome the enemy. We see people making sacrifices for those they love. We see good trampling over evil. We see people leaving the ordinary world, the people leaving the ordinary familiar world to go out, to venture forth into the unknown, like Abraham left his world and ventured into the unknown to be part of the healing of the human race. So sometimes the way to understand biblical theology is to see how some of these patterns and themes and symbols are played out within a fictional scenario. So do remember for the exam that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was written by C.S. Lewis. And I hope you've enjoyed this review video. I found it helpful to walk through the redemptive historical narrative, telling it as a story, because really that's what it is. The Bible is not just a list of ideas. The Bible isn't just a list of facts for us to memorize. It's a story, and it's a story of God healing the earth, and it's a story that we can participate in. And that's why I find biblical theology so exciting. I hope that you do as well. So I leave on my trip tomorrow. Please keep me in your prayers as I travel to 2 conferences and also travel to see family in Idaho. Please keep me in your prayers, and I'm praying for all of you. And I look forward to connecting when I get back. May God bless you. Have a great day. Bye.